Okay, I believe we're recording. All right, so I'm here presenting to my whole family and my dog, so hopefully we don't have a lot of distractions going on, but I thought a video would make it a little bit more fun. So my article was developmental dyslexia, and the researchers were looking for a different perceptual strategy and how to learn a new strategy for reading for people who suffer from dyslexia. So throughout my presentation, I'm going to be referring to just dyslexia. This entire presentation, I'm talking about developmental dyslexia specifically, and it's defined as an unexplained retardation of reading skill in spite of adequate tutoring and the absence of recognizable aberration in visual resolution or neurological state or intellectual status. I will be also using the term lateral masking. And lateral masking is the adverse interaction between neighboring visual icons on each other. So ordinary readers can mask text surrounding the word they're focused on reading, whereas people with dyslexia are unable to mask the text surrounding the word they're currently attempting to read. So the purpose of all the studies I'm about to discuss was to address the symptom of dyslexia, which is the inability to read, rather than the cause of the dyslexia. So the researchers addressed this through studying the physiology of reading versus the physiology of being unable to read. They wanted to demonstrate that a new perceptual strategy can be learned by dyslexics, which will allow for efficient reading and narrowing of the FRF. I'll be explaining what an FRF is shortly. So the thesis of the researchers was that the difference between ordinary readers and dyslexics is in their ability to do lateral masking. They believe that the dyslexics are unable to distinguish specific words from the surrounding text because they're unable to mask the surrounding text. The researchers thought of it like this. So a word can be made more vivid by putting a spotlight of attention on that word, but you can have the same effect if you mask the surrounding text. So here we have an example of this. The stuff being blurry is like it's being laterally masked. So we're focusing on only. The resolution of the stuff to the sides has been decreased. So an FRF, as I previously mentioned, is what the researchers use to measure the differences in perceptions between ordinary readers and dyslexics. So it is used to measure the visual recognition of letters along the horizontal axis. It measures the distribution of lateral masking because recognition is dependent on lateral masking. If you can recognize that letter, you're obviously laterally masking other things. So the FRF procedure remained consistent throughout all 8 studies that I'll be talking about. So 2 letters get presented simultaneously on the screen. They appear for a brief moment, one at the center of the gaze and one to the left or the right along the horizontal axis. The participants are to report both letters. This is repeated about 100 to 200 times with different letters and different distances between the center of the gaze and the left or right. And the fraction of correctly recognized letters is eccentrically presented, with the fractions being plotted along the horizontal axis. This will be in the graphs that I bring up on upcoming slides. So in the first study, they had participants, they had 10 English native ordinary reading adults and 10 English native dyslexic adults. And they wanted to measure the FRF of ordinary readers versus dyslexic adults in order to note the differences between the two. That was the purpose of this study. So the results, I'll have a graph on an upcoming slide, but basically dyslexics recognize letters presented to the right significantly better than ordinary readers. Their best recognition was actually letters when they were on the right rather than the center of the gaze as is in ordinary readers. So on my next slide, the FRF of the ordinary readers is shown to be narrow, symmetric, with strong lateral masking surrounding the center of the gaze. Whereas in dyslexics, their FRF is extended to the right, narrow in the left, and so there's literal lateral masking in the direction of reading. All right, the graphics for this study, they're not ideal, so it'll take me a little bit to explain. So the FRF of ordinary readers is plotted in this red line, and the FRF of dyslexic readers is plotted in blue. As you can see, the left, the ordinary readers is a little bit more symmetric, but we don't care much about the left. We're more focused on the right for this particular study. There are 2 significant differences to note. Now, that is at 2.5 degrees away from the center of the gaze to the right. The ordinary reader can actually recognize letters better than dyslexic readers. This shows us that near the center of the gaze, the ordinary reader has more lateral masking, and they can recognize stuff in the center better. Now, when the letter's presented about 10 degrees to the right, the dyslexic reader can actually recognize the letter 8 times better than the ordinary reader, meaning that when a letter's farther to the right, dyslexic reader can perceive it way more clearly than an ordinary reader. So the conclusions of this is that the FRF of ordinary readers is symmetric, while the FRF of dyslexics is extended towards the right and narrow in the left. Now, the researchers indicated two possible explanations for this. One being that different hemispheric specialization in the brains of people with dyslexia. A second alternative explanation is that training in reading a language affects the shape of the FRF of dyslexics, because in this study, they were English natives and English is read left to right. So they're extended in the right, maybe this has an implication. So in their second study, they looked into this. They wanted to understand in the ways in which the direction of reading impacts a dyslexic's FRF. So this time, they took 5 Hebrew ordinary reading adults and 5 Hebrew dyslexic adults, because Hebrew is read in the opposite direction, it's read right to left. So the methods, again, they used the same thing. They wanted to measure the FRF of the ordinary readers versus the dyslexics and see if there were any differences. So results. For this graph, we're focusing more on the left this time because we're reading in the opposite direction. So they found that the dyslexic Hebrew readers had extended recognition in the left visual field, exact opposite of the English speakers. And other than that, the results were about the same as the English reader study. So ordinary readers had the same like FRF, they were symmetric, it was more like they had better focus in the center of the gaze. So the asymmetry in the FRF of adults in the direction that's like extended as opposed to the side that's narrow is about the same for both. So this means that it's a result of the way the readers are taught to read. If you're taught to read left to right, you're going to have extension in the left visual or in the right visual field if you're dyslexic. Whereas if you're taught right to left, you're going to have an extension in the left visual field. In their third study, they just wanted to show that the FRF is a reliable tool in diagnosing dyslexia. So they just needed to show that there were statistically significant results between ordinary readers and dyslexic readers. So they had 119 adult and child dyslexics as well as 65 ordinary readers. They all read left to right. So their methods. First, they took the individual's FRFs and the researchers calculated the ratio between recognition near the center and the peripheral recognition. If this number was larger than empirically set cutoff value, the person was labeled an ordinary reader, and if it was equal to or below, that person was labeled a dyslexic. They performed reading tests as well as other non-perceptual cognitive tests, which are used now to diagnose dyslexia, and they correlated the results between their FRF and these other statistics and tests that are used now to see if they were statistically related. So in the results, they found that there was a 91% agreement between their FRF and the other testing methods in kids between 7 and 16 years old, whereas there was an 83% agreement for adults who were above the age of 18. This is obviously a statistically significant result, so we can conclude that the FRF is a reliable tool. In their fourth study, they took 5 severely dyslexic adults. Now, they were to learn to mask words that they are not currently reading. So they assessed the participants' reading levels, measured their FRFs, and assigned them a regimen of practice that they recommended be used for 4 to 6 months. After their 4 to 6 month practice period, they would reassess the reading and measure the FRFs to see if there's been any changes. So this regimen of practice is used in all upcoming studies. It's consistent. The only difference is in how long each person practiced per day. So the beginning of the regimen of practice is they want to practice small-scale hand-eye coordination tasks. So this could be painting or drawing, and the researchers recommended the participants do this for 1 to 2 hours per day. The reading practice, then they did reading practice with a specifically designed mask for a recommended 1 hour per day. So the mask's purpose was to make it possible to read a word in isolation, learn to recognize different forms of words, and read words sequentially. The mask procedure was, it was a small rectangular window that was cut to be a little larger than the word to be read. So it is covering all other words that are not being read. They would lay the mask on the text and shift it along the text as they are reading. So in the results of this study, all the cases of the FRF, they all narrowed on the right-hand side. Now this is obviously in the dyslexic participants. In all cases, reading improved dramatically. So one participant in particular improved from a 3rd grade reading level to an 11th grade reading level, which is pretty outstanding, as I can tell from your face. Within the first month of practicing, they actually were getting phone calls with participants saying things like, so that's what a word looks like. The participants really, they saw the improvement in themselves. After testing, the participants were asked to stop the regimen. And a few months after stopping the regimen, their reading level dropped and their FRF widened again. So in studies 5 to 8, they had children from the age of 7 to 16 and adults from 18 to 39. There were 41 dyslexics and 55 ordinary readers. There were 3 studies done in the USA and 1 study was done in Germany. In all studies, they measured the efficiency and details of the learning process in their new perceptual reading strategy, which is their regimen of practice. So, participants were interviewed about their reading problem, their medical status, their handedness, and their intelligence level. There were standardized reading tests administered. So the one in Germany was the Zuricher Lesset test, because that's the Germany standard. And then in the USA, they had letter word identification, passage comprehension, and word attack, which was used from the standardized Woodcock-Johnson psychoeducational data revised. They used these to determine if the participant was dyslexic or an ordinary reader, and they measured their FRFs. They then did a concluding interview, which explained the condition to the participants, and the regimen of practice was assigned and explained. So the dyslexics were contacted every 3 to 4 weeks just for support and guidance and asked if they have any questions for the researchers. And 3 to 10 months later, they were retested. Some participants 5 years later were given a long-term follow-up. So study 5 of the studies 5 to 8 was done in the USA. There were dyslexic children and ordinary children in the study. The ordinary children served as a control just to compare. So for the initial test, the average initial deficit was 2.2 grade levels below where the dyslexic children would be. And at least each individual was at least 1.8 grade levels below average. The FRF of dyslexic children was significantly wider than the FRF of ordinary readers as expected. The final test was done 5 to 10 months later. The reading was tested and the FRFs were measured again. The length of the practice period and the daily duration of practice was noted. So the average person practiced for about 33 weeks, and they spent about 0.8 hours on the hand-eye coordination task and 0.35 hours per day on the reading with the window. The final reading deficit got measured again, and it was done in respect to the grade the child was in during the final test. So this occurred over several months. If they were in grade 5, now when they're in grade 6, we're going based off grade 6 reading level. So they found that there was an average improvement of 2.1 grade levels. So they were only in a deficit of about 0.4 grade levels from their peers. And this was only over about 7.5 months. This is twice the rate of improvement in the ordinary readers, which were serving as the controls. The FRF narrowed significantly in the right visual field, and there was no longer a significant difference between the dyslexic children and the ordinary reading children. These results suggest that learning the new perceptual strategy can improve reading in dyslexic children. In studies 6 and 7, there was a part A and a follow-up kind of part B. So in part A, studies were just used as controls to understand the differences between the results of the newly proposed regimen of practice and existing methods for treating dyslexia. This took place in Germany and Massachusetts. There were 15 dyslexic children in Germany, 12 in Massachusetts, and 6 with ordinary reading levels in each to serve as a baseline. Children were from the 3rd grade to the 6th grade. So in the initial test in Germany, the average reading deficit was 2.5 grade levels in the dyslexic children, and in Massachusetts, the average reading level deficit was 2.1 grade levels. After initial testing was done with the dyslexic children, they were divided into two groups. The experimental group was given the newly proposed regimen of practice, and the reference group was given using just the same remedies they were given at school. 3 to 4 months later, they were retested and their FRFs were measured again. They practiced for an average of 3.3 months with 0.0 hours a day on the hand-eye coordination and 0.33 hours per day on reading with the window. So, the results. In both studies, both in Germany and Massachusetts, there was an average improvement in reading in the experimental group that was far larger than the average improvement in the reference group. So it was about 1.2 levels for the experimental group and only a 0.2 level improvement in the reference group. All experimental dyslexics improved by at least 1 grade level in the Massachusetts study, which is something to note. The largest individual improvement in the reference group was only 0.5 grade levels, so that's far below the experimental group. The FRF of the experimental dyslexics narrowed significantly, while the FRF of the reference dyslexics remained about the same as their initial measurements. So in conclusion, this study kind of showed that the proposed regimen of practice is significantly greater at improving reading in dyslexic children than the currently used practices. So in part B, after the final testing of reading levels, the regimen of practice was given to the dyslexic children who were in the reference group. After a few months of practicing the newly proposed way, the reference group reading levels were brought up to the level of the experimental dyslexics. So the regimen of practice worked for both groups. And in the meantime, the experimental dyslexics continued to practice over about 5 months, and they improved an additional 1.1 grade levels. So, some long-term observationals from these studies were that about 5 years after starting the study in Germany, they interviewed 13 of the 15 participants. 9 said they liked to read and do so for about 1 to 3 hours per day. They all rated themselves as being able to read and write very good, or medium, and they felt they were no longer dyslexic. Unfortunately, one participant did feel he was still dyslexic. No one had received additional interventions for reading after learning the new perceptual strategy, so these positive notes were coming from the regimen of practice that's being proposed. They all reported that the regimen had opened them up to easier reading and that the window makes reading easier. And the Massachusetts follow-up that was done about 2 to 3 years later, and it had similar results. In study 8, the final study, there were 14 adult dyslexics. The methods included, so they did initial testing sessions to get their reading levels, they did the period of practice of the regimen, and then they did a final session of testing 7 months later. The average length of practice was about 6.5 months in participants, for about 0.9 hours per day on hand-eye coordination and 0.5 hours per day on window reading. The initial deficits were about 3.8 grade levels for word identification, 4.7 for passage comprehension, and 7.1 for word attack. And there were significantly wider FRFs in dyslexics than in the ordinary readers as expected. So the results. There was an average 1.1 grade level deficit at the end of the word identification, so 3.4 grade level improvement. In the passage comprehension, they improved about 5 grade levels to average 0.2 grade level deficit. And in word attack, they improved about 4.5 grade levels for an average 3.2 grade level deficit. Now, there is an explanation for why word attack has a greater deficit. It's in the notes of my presentation, because otherwise this presentation would be very long. And there was significant narrowing of the FRF in the dyslexic children, making their FRFs appear similar to ordinary readers. A follow-up was done about 1 to 3 years after the start of the study, and it had some similar results to the follow-up that was done on those Germany kids. And they were similar. They found reading easier, they enjoyed it more, and they no longer considered themselves to be dyslexic. So the overall takeaways from this study is that there's a significant improvement in reading abilities after the proposed practice regimen was introduced. There was immediate improvement in reading that was maintained for a long time. And because reading improved and the FRF was narrowed, the new perceptual strategy learned was successful in laterally masking the region around the word that the dyslexics are trying to read. All right, multiple choice question. So, The new perceptual strategy introduced to the dyslexics improved their reading ability by A, allowing them to practice only a little each day, leading to less frustration. B, allowing them to laterally mask the region around the word they are reading. C, combining the new strategy and previously used strategies into one master plan for learning to read. And D, it did not improve their reading ability. Does anyone know? Yes, Mom.
I'm going with B.
B. You are right. Okay, the discussion question because Jen's dying to participate. So, in studies 5 to 8, the dyslexic participants did the regimen of practice at home on their own. What are some ways in which at-home practice could be advantageous to some participants while detrimental to others? Anyone have any ideas? No.
Some people would have support at home, and others may not have the same type of support going on at home.
Yes, that was what I was thinking. Depends on socioeconomic status, their culture, what kind of resources they have at home, their home environment, and all that stuff. Okay, I'm assuming you have no questions, so that is the end of my presentation. All done. And that's mine. I know, I'm still recording, Josh. Still recording.